Imagine walking into a vast cathedral, its ceiling painted with stories you're told are true. Every color whispers salvation. Every echo promises meaning. And yet, beneath the silence of that holy space, you feel a question rising, slow and defiant. What if none of this is real? That question, uninvited and dangerous, is where true freedom begins. Not the kind of freedom that waves flags or breaks chains, but the quieter kind. The kind that walks out of the temple and breathes for the first time without permission. You see, most people don't seek truth. They seek comfort dressed as truth. They don't ask if something is real, they ask if it feels safe to believe it. And so, entire civilizations have built their peace of mind on foundations of fear. Fear of death, fear of emptiness, fear of being wrong, fear of being alone in a silent universe that does not answer back. The mind that dares to reject the story of gods is not arrogant, it's honest. Because rejecting comfort is the purest act of integrity. It's saying, I would rather face uncertainty than kneel to illusion. Religion, of course, thrives on the opposite impulse. It tells you that mystery must mean magic, that the unknown must have an author. It hands you a script and calls it truth, as if truth could be manufactured by repetition. But the beauty of the unconverted mind is that it refuses to let borrowed stories do its thinking. The irony is that doubt, which religion calls a sin, is the very thing that gives birth to every human advancement we've ever made. Doubt is the reason medicine replaced miracles. Doubt is the reason we fly instead of praying for wings. Doubt built telescopes where once we only built temples. But doubt is uncomfortable, and comfort is profitable. That's why religion never sells truth. It sells certainty. It's the oldest business model in the world. Promise people they're special, forgive their worst impulses, and charge admission to paradise. The human desire to believe is not a flaw, it's a wound. We created gods to bandage the unbearable, to explain why life is short, unfair, and often meaningless. We imagined eyes in the sky so that our suffering might at least matter to someone. We told ourselves that our deaths were not endings but transitions, because endings are for stories, not souls. But when you strip away that comforting architecture, what remains? Not despair, not nihilism, just reality, unadorned, magnificent, and indifferent. The stars don't need to love you to be beautiful. The universe doesn't need to know your name to be worth exploring. Meaning isn't discovered, it's built day by day, in the brief light between birth and oblivion. That, perhaps, is the quiet scandal of the unbeliever's mind. Not rebellion, but responsibility. Because when no invisible hand guides you, morality becomes an act of will, not obedience. You help others not because a book commands it, but because empathy demands it. You tell the truth not to avoid hell, but because lies corrode the soul long before any eternal punishment could. And that's the terrifying part. When no one's watching, you realize your actions are yours alone. No heavenly witness, no cosmic scoreboard, just you, your conscience, and the echo of your own choices. That is not a loss, it's a coronation, the crown of self-awareness replacing the leash of faith. For some, that realization feels like exile. For others, it feels like coming home. The mind that refuses to kneel is not godless. It simply refuses to outsource its wonder. It looks at the night sky not for answers, but for questions. It listens to silence and calls it honest. It looks at death and says, I will not invent eternity to avoid you. There's something profoundly human about that kind of courage, to walk without celestial maps, to build morality without myth, to love without reward, to live without permission. And yet, the irony is that those who reject the idea of gods often understand reverence better than those who worship. Because reverence is not obedience, it's awe without ownership. It's looking at existence and saying, you owe me nothing, and still, I am grateful. That gratitude, pure, untranslatable, undirected, is what religion once tried to capture before it traded wonder for walls. If faith is a comfort blanket, then reason is the cold wind that strips it away. Yet, in that chill, something remarkable happens. You begin to feel your own skin. People often mistake disbelief for emptiness, as if rejecting the supernatural leaves a vacuum. But the absence of illusion is not a void, it's clarity. When the noise of divine authority fades, the whisper of your own thoughts becomes audible for the first time. It's a strange kind of rebirth, one without baptism or choir, only the quiet pulse of self-awareness. Religious conviction, by contrast, is rarely about truth. It's about belonging. A tribe gathered around a shared story, and that's fine until the story demands blindness as proof of loyalty. Until belonging requires that you suspend thought, amputate curiosity, and replace the living pulse of wonder with the embalmed comfort of, "I already know." The tragedy is that religion often begins with awe, genuine awe, and ends with dogma. A spark of curiosity about existence becomes a bureaucratic institution of rules. Questions are replaced by answers, and those answers are guarded like property deeds. The search for truth devolves into the defense of tradition. But truth has no need for defense. Truth is immune to disbelief. It doesn't crumble when questioned. It clarifies. The fragile thing is not truth. It's belief. Belief trembles when examined because it knows it was never built to endure scrutiny. You'll notice that those who are most certain in their faith often require that everyone else share it. There's a reason for that. Conviction is fragile in isolation. It survives only in echo chambers, cathedrals of agreement where doubt is treated as disease. That's why ancient heretics were burned, not because they were wrong, but because they threatened the comfort of those who couldn't afford to be uncertain. Imagine a God so mighty he creates galaxies, yet so insecure he needs your worship to feel complete. That's not divinity, that's projection. The jealous, punitive gods of Scripture are mirrors for our own fears, not metaphysical beings. They inherit our ego, our anger, our tribal instincts, and then demand we call that moral perfection. It's a neat trick, really. Create a being in your own image, make him eternal, then obey him forever. It's spiritual narcissism disguised as humility, and yet we accept it because the alternative, our smallness, is unbearable. We don't want a vast, indifferent universe. We want a father figure in the sky, someone who sees us, forgives us, and promises that the chaos of life has a hidden order. It's an emotional necessity, not an intellectual conclusion. That's the genius of religion. It doesn't sell reality, it sells reassurance. It replaces the complexity of the unknown with the simplicity of a story. The universe has a plan. Everything happens for a reason. These are lullabies for adults who never stopped fearing the dark. But the universe doesn't have a plan. It has physics. It has probabilities, accidents, and improbable miracles of coincidence that require no divine intention to exist. The rain falls on the believer and the skeptic alike, not because of justice, but because gravity doesn't negotiate. That might sound bleak to some. To others, it's liberating, because when you stop pretending the universe cares, you begin to care more. When no cosmic script dictates your purpose, you must write your own. And that makes every choice, every act of kindness, every small rebellion against cruelty, infinitely more meaningful. Meaning that isn't assigned from above, must be earned below. And that's where true morality lives, not in fear of punishment, but in the recognition of shared fragility. We help others not because we expect divine reward, but because suffering recognizes itself. The believer often says, "Without faith, where does morality come from?" As if empathy were a miracle, not a mammal's trait. But morality existed long before commandments were carved into stone. It lived in our species' capacity to feel another's pain, to recognize that harm done to one diminishes all. Religion didn't invent compassion, it branded it. The danger comes when morality becomes outsourced to invisible authority, when good is defined not by consequence, but by compliance, when cruelty can be sanctified simply by adding the word holy before it. History overflows with examples. Wars fought in the name of love, persecutions carried out in the name of mercy, and somehow we still call that faith. It's strange, isn't it? The same people who say life without faith is meaningless will often admit they obey out of fear, fear of hell, fear of judgment, fear of divine wrath. That's not devotion, that's extortion. And any morality that requires terror to enforce it is counterfeit. Fear might control behavior, but it cannot create virtue. Only understanding can do that. The moment you stop believing in divine surveillance, you discover the true test of character. Doing good with no one watching. Choosing kindness when no heaven will reward it. That's the quiet heroism of the thinking mind. The courage to be ethical without external eyes. And yet, That courage terrifies many, because it means accountability. You can't confess your failures to a priest and feel cleansed. You must live with them, learn from them, and change. It's harder, it's lonelier, but it's real. And reality, undiluted, unsupervised, and unconsoled, is the ultimate teacher. When the gods fall silent, the responsibility for meaning falls to us. That's the real revelation, though no burning bush ever announced it. When people say that disbelief leaves life empty, what they truly mean is that it removes the script. It takes away the tidy narrative where everything has purpose and every tragedy is part of a divine plan. And without that script, yes, there's silence. But silence isn't emptiness, it's space. It's the first breath after the noise stops. It's the pause where thought begins. The trouble is, silence exposes us. It forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that meaning is not given, it's made. And that realization divides people more sharply than any theology ever could. Some run back to the temples, others stay and start building. Those who stay discover something remarkable. When you stop looking up for permission, you start looking around with compassion. The world becomes sacred, not because someone declared it so, but because it's the only one we have. The people beside you become precious, not because a God commands you to love them, but because you know what it feels like to hurt, to lose, to need. It's not holiness that creates morality. It's vulnerability. Think of all the rituals we've invented to feel less alone in the void. Prayers, hymns, creeds, confessions. They all serve one simple purpose: to convince ourselves that the universe is listening. But the universe doesn't listen. And yet, people do. That's the quiet redemption of a godless world. Empathy replaces eternity. A child cries in a war zone, not because a god failed to protect him, but because human cruelty succeeded in reaching him. The remedy to that cruelty is not prayer, it's action. The divine never shows up, but the neighbor sometimes does. The friend, the stranger, the one who sees suffering and doesn't outsource compassion to heaven. That, in itself, is a kind of miracle. Not the supernatural kind, the human kind. Religion tells you that morality without faith is impossible. But if that were true, the most devout societies would also be the most humane. They are not. The record of history reads like an indictment written in blood and incense. Inquisitions, crusades, witch hunts, forced conversions, massacres, all justified by divine authority. Believers claim morality was born on sacred ground, but morality has been bleeding on that ground for centuries. And what makes it even more tragic is that the idea of God at its origin might have been beautiful, a poetic metaphor for the mystery of existence, a symbol of the longing for meaning. But symbols have a way of becoming tyrants when taken too literally. The moment myth is mistaken for fact, wonder turns into weaponry. We built temples to celebrate the unknown. We ended up using them to silence those who dared to explore it. Consider Galileo, dragged before the church for saying that the earth moves. His crime wasn't blasphemy, it was curiosity. But curiosity is a mortal threat to systems that rely on unquestioning obedience. And so, he was forced to whisper what the universe shouts in every direction. Et pour si mouve. And yet, it moves. That sentence could be the anthem of every mind that has ever broken free. The tragedy of faith is that it asks for surrender where we need courage. It asks for obedience where we need thought. It tells us the answers before we've learned to ask the right questions. And it does so with an extraordinary twist of irony. It claims humility while assuming omniscience. God's ways are mysterious, they say, and yet they claim to know exactly what he wants, who he loves, and who deserves eternal torment. That's not humility. That's intellectual arrogance wrapped in piety. There's nothing humble about believing the universe revolves around your personal salvation. Humility is not kneeling before an invisible throne. It's looking at a vast cosmos and realizing how small we are and still choosing to be kind. It's knowing we are stardust, temporary, fragile, and yet capable of empathy. That is humility. That is grace without mythology. But religion doesn't want humility. It wants submission. And submission masquerades as virtue only when fear wears the mask of faith. It's curious how often believers describe disbelief as arrogance, when in truth, disbelief is the ultimate act of intellectual modesty. It says, I do not know. It refuses to fill the unknown with fantasies of certainty. It accepts the limits of human understanding and still moves forward, seeking. That's not arrogance, it's honesty. The believer says, I know because I have faith. The skeptic says, I do not know, but I will keep asking. Which one sounds more human? Which one sounds more alive? Curiosity is not a sin, it's the engine of evolution. The moment we stopped worshiping thunder, we began understanding electricity. The moment we stopped fearing disease as divine punishment, we invented medicine. Every inch of human progress is carved from the territory religion once forbade us to explore. And still, the faithful warn that without belief, life has no purpose. But purpose is not something handed down. It's something forged. A painter finds it in color, a teacher in a student's eyes, a parent in the fragile heartbeat they protect. None of that requires heaven. All of it requires humanity. When purpose is built, not bestowed, it becomes unshakable, because what you create for yourself cannot be taken away by disbelief. It is rooted in lived reality, not celestial fantasy. And perhaps that's what frightens religion most, the realization that it is unnecessary, that we are capable of awe, morality, love, and meaning all by ourselves. It's not that humanity outgrew God. It's that God was the training wheel of consciousness, and we finally learned to balance. The human mind is an extraordinary paradox. It can split atoms, but still fears invisible ghosts. It can map galaxies billions of light years away, yet trembles at the thought of being alone. And perhaps that is the essence of belief, not ignorance, but loneliness. Religion begins as the poetry of the frightened. Faced with death, chaos, and the unbearable vastness of existence, we reached for comfort. We built gods the way a child builds imaginary friends, to make the darkness less cruel. And for a time, that worked. Myth was medicine for our helplessness. But what begins as a metaphor becomes a prison when we forget that it's poetry. The tragedy of human history is not that we believed. It's that we stopped recognizing belief as art. Look at ancient myths. Zeus hurling lightning, Odin hanging on the tree of wisdom, Shiva dancing the universe into being. These were never scientific claims. They were attempts to give emotional shape to mystery. The problem began when we stopped calling them stories and started calling them facts. When metaphor hardened into law, when perhaps became must. That's when the artists became priests, and the poets became persecuted. You see, imagination was supposed to liberate us, but religion domesticated it. It took the wild dream of wonder and fenced it within doctrine. Suddenly, the infinite became literal, and the literal became sacred. And once something is called sacred, it becomes untouchable, unquestionable, and anything that cannot be questioned inevitably becomes dangerous. Because power loves certainty. It feeds on it. Every priesthood is built not on revelation, but on authority. It's not about truth, it's about control. Control over minds, over morality, over meaning itself. That's why religions throughout history have always feared the same thing. Not evil, but education. Knowledge is corrosive to dogma. It doesn't kill faith outright. It dissolves it slowly, like acid on stone. Every time a question is asked that cannot be answered with scripture, the edifice trembles a little. And yet, that trembling is the sound of progress. But notice how deeply the instinct to believe remains. Even when we move beyond religion, we often replace gods with ideologies, politics, celebrity, identity, new altars, same psychology. The urge to worship didn't die. It merely changed costume. We still crave belonging. We still want certainty. We still want someone to tell us, you are right, you are chosen, you are safe. That's why disbelief isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a harder one. The story of growing up. Because the end of faith is not nihilism, it's maturity. It's learning to walk without the cosmic parent holding your hand, and adulthood, both individual and collective, is terrifying. It demands that we accept responsibility for our world. No divine plan to blame, no heaven to wait for, no eternal justice to balance our failures. Just us, flawed, temporary, but capable of astonishing good. We often talk about freedom as if it's easy. It isn't. Freedom is heavy. It asks you to think, to act, to choose, to bear the weight of your own decisions. That's why so many prefer the simplicity of obedience. It's comforting to outsource morality, to let someone else write the rules. But morality outsourced is morality diluted. If your compassion depends on commandment, it's not compassion, it's compliance. If your integrity depends on divine reward, it's not integrity, it's transaction. True goodness is quiet. It needs no witness, no scripture, no applause. It exists in the small, unrecorded moments, returning the lost wallet, speaking truth when silence would be safer, choosing empathy over ego. No angels descend to take notes, and no devils wait to tempt you. There's only you, your conscience, and the question. Who do you want to be, knowing there's no eternal scoreboard? That question terrifies believers because it removes the safety net. Without divine oversight, morality becomes real, fragile, fallible, but genuine. And that's the beauty of it. You don't need the threat of hell to be kind. You don't need the promise of heaven to be brave. You don't need forgiveness written in the sky when you can offer it yourself, imperfectly, here on earth. The irony is that once you remove the divine spectator, life becomes infinitely more sacred. Every moment matters precisely because it ends. Every choice matters because there's no cosmic edit button. Every love matters because it will vanish. And that's what makes it precious. Eternity, if it existed, would cheapen everything. What is a sunset if it lasts forever? What is love if it cannot be lost? Mortality gives beauty its edge. Transience gives meaning its urgency. The believer says, without eternity, life is meaningless. The thinker replies, without endings, life is empty. We fear death not because we understand it, but because we misunderstand life. We assume its purpose must come from outside it, as if existence were a test, a prelude, a waiting room for something better. But what if this is it? What if life isn't preparation but the performance itself? That idea doesn't lead to despair. It leads to intensity, to presence, to gratitude. When you stop living for eternity, you start living for now. You taste food more deeply. You listen longer. You forgive faster. You stop postponing meaning for some promised afterlife and start building it here, breath by breath. And slowly, something extraordinary happens. You stop fearing the silence of the heavens because you realize that silence is not absence. It's peace. It's the quiet of a universe that doesn't demand, doesn't punish, doesn't bargain. It simply is. And in that vast indifference, you find something far more honest than love. It's acceptance. The universe accepts you without condition. It doesn't require belief to exist. It doesn't care what you worship, who you love, or what book you quote. It just keeps being. And in that vast neutrality lies the most profound kind of belonging. Not chosen, not special, just here. There's a quiet irony in all of this. The faithful often say that disbelief strips life of meaning, but in truth, it strips life of hierarchy. When the heavens fall silent, no one is above or below anyone else. Kings lose their divine right. Prophets lose their monopoly on truth. The beggar and the philosopher stand equal before the indifferent stars. That equality is terrifying for those who built their power on being closer to God. Because once the divine authority evaporates, all that's left is humanity, messy, flawed, self-determining humanity. And there's no pulpit high enough to control that. Religion thrives on the fear of freedom. It tells you that without divine guidance, you'll be lost, that without commandments, chaos will reign. But the world outside the temple isn't chaos. It's complexity. It's uncertain, yes, but not meaningless. It's wild, beautiful, and difficult, like an unscripted life should be. Freedom demands maturity, not miracles. It asks for courage, not confession. And courage is rarer than belief. It takes courage to say, I don't know. Courage to live without cosmic insurance. Courage to stand under an empty sky and still choose love, still choose goodness, still choose joy. It's not faith that builds character, it's the absence of it. When the promise of divine reward disappears, what remains is raw authenticity. You start doing things not because they're sacred, but because they're sincere. You start seeing people not as souls to be saved, but as minds to be understood, as hearts to be cared for. The irony, of course, is that in shedding the idea of God, many discover the very virtues religion claimed to own: compassion, humility, awe, reverence. But this time, they aren't imposed from above. They bloom from within, take awe, for example. The religious person looks at the stars and feels divine design. The free mind looks and feels wonder without needing a designer. The pattern itself is enough. The mathematics of it, the improbability of it, the vastness of it, these are miracles that don't require permission to exist. The night sky doesn't need a signature to be sublime. And when you realize that, you start to see how much beauty religion actually obscures. When everything is labeled as God's will, nothing is appreciated for what it is. A sunset becomes a postcard from heaven instead of an atmospheric symphony of light. A human act of kindness becomes grace instead of genuine empathy. A scientific discovery becomes divine inspiration instead of human brilliance. Faith steals credit from reality. And yet, despite all evidence to the contrary, belief persists because it comforts. It's far easier to think you're part of a plan than to accept you're part of an accident. But accidents can be beautiful. Every living thing on this planet is the result of a cosmic chain of coincidences stretching back billions of years. That's not meaningless. That's miraculous. And it's a miracle that doesn't ask for worship. That's what makes it pure. When you remove the expectation of divine gratitude, the awe becomes honest. It's not transactional. You don't have to praise the sunrise to enjoy it. You don't have to fear the sunset to feel its sadness. Existence raw and unedited is enough. The hardest truth is also the simplest. The universe doesn't care. And that's precisely why we must. Because if no God is watching, then we are the witnesses. We are the ones responsible for seeing, for caring, for remembering. If no eternal justice will come, then justice must begin here, in our hands. If no paradise awaits, then the only paradise worth building is the one we create together, imperfect, temporary, fragile, real. That realization doesn't rob life of meaning, it fills it with urgency. Every act of kindness, every honest conversation, every moment of laughter shared under a mortal sky becomes infinitely valuable because it will not last. And maybe that's the most profound form of holiness there is, to love things because they end. The believer builds temples to eternity. The thinker builds gratitude for impermanence. One kneels to the infinite, the other walks humbly through the finite. Both feel awe, but only one understands it. It's strange how the absence of gods makes the world more sacred. When you stop believing that a divine artist painted the universe, you start seeing how every brushstroke paints itself. The clouds, the rivers, the birth of stars. No plan, no author, yet perfect in their chaos. And somehow, that feels more divine than divinity ever did. Maybe that's the final irony. That disbelief doesn't destroy wonder, it restores it. Because when you stop trying to explain everything with stories of gods, you start noticing how breathtakingly improbable everything is without them. You realize that the real miracle was never written in a book. It's written in the laws of physics, in DNA, in consciousness, in every act of love that defies the logic of survival. You realize that meaning doesn't descend from heaven. It rises from the human heart. And once you see that, you never need a sermon again. You don't need sacred texts to tell you how to be good. You don't need prayers to feel gratitude. You don't need promises of eternity to cherish this moment. You simply live, awake, aware, and unafraid. The old gods fade, but the stars remain. The temples crumble, but the mind endures. The myths collapse, but the hunger for truth, the beautiful, terrible human hunger, keeps burning. And that hunger is all the divinity will ever need.